The sun was not a friend here. It was a judgment, a white-hot anvil hanging in a bleached blue sky, beating down on the cracked earth until the very air shimmered with malice. This was a land that had surrendered to heat and silence long ago, a place where life was an intruder, a fleeting mistake swiftly corrected by thirst and time. The wind, when it came, offered no relief. It was a dry, rasping breath that scoured the landscape, carrying grit that stung the eyes and stole the moisture from a man's soul. It whispered through the skeletal arms of saguaros and moaned over flat-topped mesas, a constant, lonely sound that could drive a person mad with its emptiness. Here, color was a memory from a kinder world. Everything was a variation of brown and gray and faded ochre. The ground was a mosaic of baked clay, sharp stones, and sand so fine it flowed like water. Spiny things grew here, cacti with cruel needles, twisted mesquite, and thorny bushes that clung to life with a stubbornness born of desperation. They offered no shade, only the threat of pain to any who stumbled too close. It was a world stripped bare, a place of brutal honesty where survival was the only truth that mattered. And in the heart of this desolation, a flicker of color that did not belong, a splash of faded calico, torn and dirt-caked, almost lost against the rust-red rocks. It was a woman, or what was left of one. She lay half-sprawled in the meager shadow of a granite boulder, a shadow that was shrinking with every passing minute as the sun climbed toward its zenith. Her name was Clara, though the name felt like a relic from another life, a word whispered by a stranger. Consciousness was a tattered cloth she clung to, slipping through her fingers into a dark, swirling sea. One moment, there was the searing pain, the blinding light, the suffocating heat. The next, there was nothing but the cool, quiet abyss. She swam back to the surface on a wave of agony. It was centered in her side, a deep, gnawing fire that seemed to consume her from the inside out. Her left hand was pressed against it, her fingers sticky and dark with her own lifeblood, which had long since dried to a stiff crust on the fabric of her dress. Every breath was a labor, a shallow gasp that sent a fresh jolt of fire through her abdomen. She tried to shift, to ease the pressure of the sharp rock digging into her spine, but the movement sent a white-hot spike of torment through her body, and she fell back with a choked sob, her vision swimming with black spots. Dust, it was in her mouth, her nose, her hair. It coated her cracked lips and gritted between her teeth. Thirst was a living thing inside her, a creature with claws, tearing at her throat, making it impossible to swallow. She dreamed of water, not a river or a lake, but just a single, cool drop. She would have traded her soul for it, if she'd had the strength to make the bargain. Fragmented images, sharp as broken glass, tore through the fog in her mind. The rumble of wagon wheels, the easy laughter of her father, his hands steady on the reins, the scent of pine and trail dust, the promise of El Paso, of a new beginning. Then, the splintering crack of a rifle shot, the high, terrified whinny of a horse, shouting, rough hands pulling her down from the wagon seat, a face, bearded and cruel, looming over her, smelling of sweat and cheap whiskey. He'd smiled. That was the part that haunted her most. It wasn't a smile of mirth, but of possession, of a casual cruelty that saw her as nothing more than an object, a thing to be used and discarded. She remembered the glint of the sun on a pistol barrel, the cold, hard press of it against her skin, the struggle, her own scream, thin and useless in the vast emptiness. Then the deafening roar, the punch to her side that stole her breath and sent her tumbling into the dirt. They had taken everything, the horses, the wagon, the few coins her father had sewn into the lining of his coat for safekeeping. They had taken her father. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the image of his still form lying beside the wagon trail, but it was burned onto the inside of her eyelids. They had looked down at her, lying in a growing pool of her own blood, and one of them had prodded her with the toe of his boot. Waste of a bullet. he'd grunted. "The buzzards and the sun will finish her." Then they were gone, their laughter fading into the oppressive silence, leaving her alone with the dead and the dying, leaving her to the sun. How long had she been here? A day too time had lost its meaning. There was only the cycle of the sun's ascent and descent, the burning light and the chilling dark. The first night had been the worst. The desert, so silent by day, came alive with skittering, unseen things. The howl of a distant coyote had sounded like a funeral dirge. The cold had seeped into her bones, a deep, shaking chill that the fire in her side could not warm. She had been certain she would die then, that her last breath would be a frozen puff of air under a canopy of indifferent stars. But the sun had returned, bringing with it the familiar torment of heat and thirst, and with it a tiny, stubborn ember of will. She would not die here, not like this, not as a forgotten piece of refuse for the buzzards to pick clean. The thought was a weak and flickering flame in the storm of her pain, but it was there. She had to move. She had to find help. With a monumental effort that cost her nearly all her remaining strength, she began to crawl. She didn't know which way to go. There were no landmarks, no trails, just an endless, undulating sea of rock and sand. She simply moved away from the place of her despair. Each movement was a fresh hell. The sharp stones tore at her hands and knees. The hot ground burned her skin. The fire in her side pulsed with every agonizing inch she gained. She left a dark, smeared trail behind her, a desperate signature written in the dust. She crawled until her arms gave out, until her vision blurred and the world began to tilt and spin. She collapsed, her cheek pressed against the hot, unforgiving earth. Despair washed over her, cold and absolute. It was useless. There was no one, nothing, just the wind and the sun and the inevitable end. She wept then, but no tears came, only dry, racking sobs that shook her wounded body and tore at her raw throat. It was then, in that moment of complete surrender, that she heard it. At first, she thought it was a trick of the wind, another phantom sound born of the heat in her failing mind, a rhythmic, muffled beat. Thump, 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 thump. It was faint, so faint it was more a vibration felt in the bones of her skull than a sound heard with her ears. She held her breath, straining to listen past the rush of blood in her own head. Thump, 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 thump. It was getting closer, slower, steadier. It was the sound of a horse, walking at a steady pace. Hope, an emotion she thought had been baked out of her, flared with a painful, shocking intensity. It was so powerful it felt like another wound. Someone was coming. She had to call out. She had to make a sound. She opened her mouth, her dry tongue sticking to the roof. She tried to draw in a breath to shout, but the effort sent a crippling spasm through her side. All that came out was a dry, pathetic croak, a sound no louder than a lizard skittering over a rock. "No, louder!" She tried again, forcing the air from her lungs, ignoring the daggers of pain. "Help!" It was a whisper, a thread of sound immediately snatched away and shredded by the wind. The hoofbeats were closer now. She could hear the creak of saddle leather, the soft jingle of a bridle. It was real. It had to be. Panic mingled with hope. What if they didn't see her? What if they passed by, leaving her to this slow, agonizing death? She was just a crumpled heap of rags against the rocks, easily missed. She pushed herself up with one arm, a scream of pure agony tearing through her, though it remained trapped in her throat. Her vision tunneled, the edges turning dark and fuzzy. The world was a blinding, shimmering blur. Through the haze, she could just make out a shape, a dark silhouette against the glaring sky, a horse and rider, moving slowly, deliberately. This was her last chance. She gathered every last shred of her will, every ounce of her life force, and focused it into a single point. She pushed the sound from the deepest part of her being, a sound of agony and desperation and a primal refusal to die. It wasn't a word. It was just a cry. A thin, wavering note of human suffering cast into the vast, uncaring wilderness. The rider stopped. The dark shape stood motionless, a statue in the heat shimmer. Had he heard, or was he just resting his horse for a timeless moment? Nothing happened. The silence pressed in, heavier than before. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and hope. Please, she prayed to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. Please, see me. The figure shifted. The horse took a few steps. Turning, he was looking in her direction. He had heard. Relief washed over her in a dizzying, sickening wave, stealing what little strength she had left. Her arm gave out, and she slumped back against the rock. The darkness was closing in again, a heavy velvet curtain. She fought against it, clawing for purchase on the slippery edge of consciousness. She had to stay awake. She had to speak. As the sound of the approaching hoofbeats grew louder, a final, coherent thought broke through the delirium of her pain. It was a simple, desperate truth, the sum of her entire existence in that moment. Her lips parted, forming words that were barely a breath of air. There, it hurts. And then the world dissolved into blackness. The shadows were stretching long from the west, painting the plains in strokes of deep purple and dusky orange. For Noah Carter, this was the quietest part of the day, the time when the world seemed to take a slow, deep breath before the chill of night settled in. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Apollo, walked with the steady, ground-eating gait of an animal that knew the trail was nearing its end. The day had been long and unremarkable, filled with the familiar tasks of a man who works the land alone, mending a stretch of fence, tracking a stray steer, and sitting for a long spell just watching his small herd graze, his eyes scanning the vast, empty horizon that was both his comfort and his cage. Noah was a man carved from the same material as the mesas that dotted the landscape, weathered, solid, and silent. He wasn't old. Perhaps 30 years had passed him by, but his eyes held the quiet, distant look of someone much older, someone who had seen too much and learned to expect too little. His face was a map of sun and wind, with the lines etched around his eyes and a mouth that rarely curved into a smile. Words were a currency he spent sparingly, finding most conversations to be a poor substitute for the honest language of the land, the lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through dry grass, the creak of saddle leather. He had come to this piece of country 5 years ago, seeking solace in its sheer, overwhelming emptiness. He had built his cabin with his own 2 hands, sinking its foundations deep into the stubborn soil as if to anchor his own drifting soul. He ran a small herd of longhorns, enough to sustain him, enough to keep him busy from sunup to sundown. The work was hard, the loneliness a constant companion, but it was a clean, simple existence. The silence out here didn't mock him with memories. It was just silence, an empty slate. Most days, that was enough. He topped a low rise that gave him a view of his homestead, still a few miles distant. The small cabin was little more than a dark speck against the immense backdrop of the plains, a tiny testament to human stubbornness in a world that didn't seem to want it there. A thin curl of smoke would soon be rising from its stone chimney, a lonely signal to no one. As he watched, Apollo's ears twitched, and his own head tilted. He was a man who paid attention to the small things. It was how you survived out here. You noticed the way the wind shifted, the distant flight of crows, the sudden stillness of the air that meant a predator was near. And you noticed sounds that didn't belong. It was almost nothing. A high, thin thread of a sound woven into the steady sigh of the wind. He thought at first it was a hawk, or maybe the whine of a coyote pup from its den in the rocky bluffs to the north. He rode on, his mind already on the evening chores, watering the horse, checking the stock, fixing a meal he'd eat standing by the fire. The sound was gone, swallowed by the wind as quickly as it had appeared. A trick of the heat, he told himself. The air plays games with a man's hearing when he's been alone for too long. But something in him, a deep, primal instinct honed by years of solitude, wouldn't let it go. It was a note of discord in the familiar symphony of the wilderness. He reined Apollo to a halt. The horse stopped willingly, dropping his head to nibble at a tough clump of grass. Noah sat perfectly still in the saddle, closing his eyes, letting the sounds of the evening wash over him, the whisper of the wind, the soft stamp of Apollo's hoof, the creak of the leather. He listened past it all, searching for that one wrong note. For a long minute, there was nothing. He was about to dismiss it, to nudge Apollo forward and brand himself a fool for chasing ghosts. Then he heard it again. This time it was clearer, less a part of the wind and more a thing carried upon it. It was a moan, a faint, wavering sound of distress that was undeniably human. It rose and fell, weak and desperate, before being snatched away by another gust. A cold knot tightened in Noah's gut. Trouble. Human sounds in this wilderness almost always meant trouble. His first instinct was one of deep-seated caution. This was a hard land, and it bred hard men. An ambush was not out of the question. A trap laid for a lone rider with a good horse and a rifle. He could turn around, ride the long way back to the cabin, and forget he'd ever heard a thing. By morning, whatever it was would be over. The desert would have reclaimed its silence. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. He thought of Sarah. The memory came unbidden, as it always did in moments of stark choice, sharp and painful as a freshly opened wound. He remembered another sound, another cry in the emptiness he had been too far away to hear, too late to answer. He had chosen the safe path then, too, finishing a task in town instead of riding home early. He had lived with the consequence of that choice every single day since. The silence of his cabin was the monument he had built to that failure. His jaw tightened. He couldn't ride away. Not again. He nudged Apollo gently with his heels, not back toward the safety of the trail, but off it, toward the jumble of sun-scorched boulders and thorny scrub from where the sound had seemed to originate. He moved slowly, his hand resting on the stock of the Winchester rifle in its saddle scabbard. His eyes narrowed against the setting sun, scanned every shadow, every rock, every possible hiding place. The horse picked his way carefully over the uneven ground, his senses as alert as his rider's. The moaning had stopped. The silence that fell in its place was more unnerving than the sound itself. Noah reined in again, listening. Had he imagined it all, was the loneliness finally gnawing away at the edges of his reason? He was about to turn back, convinced of his own foolishness, when a flicker of movement caught his eye. No, not movement. A patch of color, a spot of faded blue and white that had no place among the reds and browns of the earth. It was low to the ground, partially hidden behind a cluster of prickly pear cactus. He dismounted, his boots making no sound in the soft dust. He kept Apollo's reins in one hand, his other never straying far from the colt at his hip. He walked forward with a quiet, deliberate tread, his senses on fire. The smell of dust and dry heat was thick in the air, but underneath it, something else, a faint, coppery scent that he knew all too well. As he drew closer, the patch of color resolved itself into a shape, the torn calico of a woman's dress. He saw a tangle of dark hair, matted with dirt and something darker, a slender arm, thrown out as if reaching for something that wasn't there. He rounded the boulder and saw her fully. She was lying on her side, curled into herself as if to ward off a blow. Her dress was ripped at the shoulder and smeared with grime and dried blood. Her face was turned away from him, but he could see the pale, unnatural stillness of her form. For a moment, he was sure he was too late, that he had found nothing more than a corpse left for the scavengers. He had seen death many times, and it had a particular kind of quiet. This was it. He took another step, his shadow falling over her. And then she stirred. A tiny, almost imperceptible shudder ran through her body. A soft, broken sound escaped her lips. So quiet he almost didn't catch it. It was less than a whisper, the last breath of a dying ember. He knelt beside her, his movements slow and careful, as if gentling a spooked foal. He could see her face now. It was young, covered in a mask of dust and dried tears, but the lines of it were fine, her features delicate even in this state of ruin. Her lips were cracked and pale. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged flutter in her chest. His gaze fell to where her hand was clutched tightly at her side, just above her hip. The fabric there was stiff and black with dried blood, and a wider, darker stain spread out from beneath her fingers. A gunshot wound, and a bad one, by the look of it. He reached out a hand, then hesitated. He hadn't touched another person in years, not with any kind of gentleness. His hands were calloused and rough, made for leather reins and wooden axe handles. Not for this, but he had to know if she was still breathing, if there was any life left to save. He gently brushed a strand of dark, sweat-soaked hair from her forehead. Her skin was fever-hot to the touch. As his fingers made contact, her eyelids fluttered. They didn't open, but a low groan vibrated in her chest. The words she had whispered before, the ones he had barely heard, came again, a little stronger this time, freighted with all the pain in the world. "There, it hurts." The words hung in the still, dry air between them. They were simple words, a child's words, yet they struck Noah with the force of a physical blow. He had heard them before, whispered in the dark, from another voice, in another lifetime, for a frozen second. The face beneath his hand was not that of a stranger, but of his wife, Sarah, in her final hours. The same bewildered pain, the same plea to a world that had no answers. The memory hit him, and for a moment, the vast, empty landscape of the desert became the suffocating closeness of a small, fire-lit room filled with the scent of sickness and grief. He flinched, pulling his hand back as if burned. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the ghost back into the locked room in his mind where it belonged. When he opened them again, the desert was back, and the woman at his feet was a stranger once more, a stranger who was dying on his land. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, and the air was beginning to cool. He looked at the woman, then back in the direction of his distant, solitary cabin. A choice had to be made. He could leave her. The desert would finish its work, and no one would ever be the wiser. It was the law of this place. The weak perish, the strong survive. To interfere was to invite chaos into his orderly, silent world. But he had heard her cry, and he had heard those last, whispered words. He could not unhear them. He had already interfered just by stopping, by listening. He had turned aside from the trail, and now this was his path. He couldn't leave her. It was a fact as solid and unchangeable as the rock beneath his knees. He would not have another ghost to haunt his long, quiet nights. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the last 5 years, Noah Carter reached down. He would do what had to be done. The twilight was failing fast, the last streaks of crimson bleeding into a deep, bruised purple. The air grew colder with a suddenness that was characteristic of the high desert, and, in the deepening gloom, Noah Carter was faced with a choice that had no right answer. He knelt in the dust, the stranger's fevered skin a stark contrast to the encroaching chill. Her life was a flickering candle flame, and the coming night was a gale bent on extinguishing it. His first move was born of a rancher's practicality. Gently, his rough fingers worked to unfasten the buttons of her bodice near the wound, peeling back the stiff, blood-soaked calico to see the damage for himself. The sight was worse than he had feared. The entry point was small and dark, puckered and angry-looking. The skin around it was swollen and had taken on a sickly, purplish hue. There was no exit wound on her back. The bullet was still inside her, lodged deep in the soft tissue of her abdomen. Infection was already setting in. He could feel the heat radiating from the wound. A foul, contained fire. His mind, accustomed to calculating risks involving cattle and weather, began to work with a cold, desperate clarity. The nearest town with a man who called himself a doctor was Harmony Creek. It was a full day's ride, pushing a horse hard. This woman was weak, burning with fever. The steady jostle of a horse would tear her apart from the inside. She would bleed internally, and the poison from the wound would spread with every jarring step. He played the scenario out in his head. He would be halfway to Harmony Creek by sunrise, and she would be a cold weight in his arms. That was a certainty. So, he could not take her to help. Could help come to her? No. There was no one to send. He was utterly alone out here, a fact that had been his comfort for 5 years and was now his curse. He could make her as comfortable as possible, give her water, and wait. It would be the kinder way to let her die. Perhaps he could sit with her through the night, a silent vigil under the stars, and in the morning, he could bury her and say a few words to a God he rarely spoke with. It would be a respectful end. It would also be a surrender, a quiet act of cowardice dressed in the clothes of compassion. His gaze fell on her face again, slack with unconsciousness, a smudge of dirt on her cheek like a child's fingerprint. There, it hurts. Her voice echoed in his mind. Not just a complaint of pain, but an accusation. An accusation against the world, against the men who had done this to her. And now, it felt against him. If he chose to do nothing, his past rose up to meet him. The ghost of his wife Sarah and their unborn child, lost to a fever that a proper doctor might have cured. He had been too late then. He had accepted fate. He would not do so again. That left only one option, a choice so terrible, so arrogant in its presumption, that it made his stomach clench. He had to take the bullet out himself, right here, tonight. The thought was madness. He was a stockman, not a surgeon. His hands were skilled at mending fences, birthing calves, and setting the occasional broken bone on a steer. He had dug a lead slug out of a horse's flank once, but a horse was not a human. His tools were a skinning knife, a bottle of whiskey, and a fire. The chances of him killing her on his cot were as high, if not higher, than the desert finishing the job. He could sever something vital. The shock alone might stop her heart, and even if he succeeded, the infection might still claim her. He looked at his hands. They were large, calloused, the knuckles scarred. They were clumsy, powerful things. To use them for such delicate, bloody work seemed like a violation. But as he looked from his hands to her still form, the debate in his mind ceased. Logic, reason, and the overwhelming odds against him all fell silent, replaced by a single, stark imperative. Try. To do nothing was to guarantee her death. To try, however slim the hope, was to offer her a chance. It was a choice between being a witness to a death or the agent of a possible one. And in that moment, he knew he could not simply be a witness again. The decision settled into him like a heavy stone. He stood up, his body moving with a new, grim purpose. First, he had to get her back to the cabin. Lifting her was a delicate operation. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight in his powerful arms. A deep groan escaped her as he shifted her, and her body went rigid with a spasm of pain, even in her unconscious state. He whispered an apology to her unhearing ears, his voice a rough, unfamiliar sound in the quiet. Getting her onto Apollo's back was even harder. He draped her over the saddle, her head and arms hanging on one side, her legs on the other, a terrible, limp parody of a rider. The journey back was a slow, agonizing procession. He walked beside the horse, one hand on her back to steady her, feeling the unnatural heat of her body through the thin fabric of her dress. With every step Apollo took, he watched her, dreading the moment she would begin to bleed afresh. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was not a welcoming sight. It was a stark, masculine space, smelling of wood smoke, leather, and solitude. A single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a cot in the corner. This was his sanctuary, a place where no new pain had ever been allowed to enter. Tonight, that would change. He laid her gently on his cot, the straw-stuffed mattress rustling under her weight. Her breathing was shallower now, her face paler in the gloom. He worked quickly, a man possessed by a terrible necessity. He lit 2 more lanterns, filling the small room with a bright, clinical yellow light that banished the comforting shadows. He stoked the fire until it roared in the hearth, its heat pushing back the night's chill. On the hook over the flames, he hung his largest kettle, filled with water from the barrel by the door. Next, his tools. From his saddlebags, he retrieved a small, sharp skinning knife with a bone handle. It was his best blade, honed to a razor's edge. He looked at it, imagining its purpose changing from skinning a rabbit to cutting into human flesh, and felt a wave of nausea. He took a long, ragged breath and set it on the table. Beside it, he placed a pair of pliers from his toolbox, old and pitted, but strong. From a small wooden chest under his cot, he pulled a bottle of whiskey, nearly full. It was his one luxury, saved for the coldest nights. But its purpose now would not be comfort. He found a clean rag, tore it into strips, and set them aside. When the water in the kettle was boiling, he poured some into a tin basin. He dropped the knife and the pliers into the remaining boiling water in the kettle, letting the heat scour them. He scrubbed his own hands and forearms with harsh lye soap and the hot water from the basin until his skin was raw and red. Everything was ready. The room was hot and bright. The sterilized tools lay on a piece of clean cloth on the table. The whiskey stood like a dark sentinel. He looked at the woman on the cot. She hadn't moved. He prayed she would stay that way. He poured a generous amount of whiskey onto another rag and approached the cot. He had to clean the wound first. As the alcohol-soaked cloth touched her skin, her body arched in a violent, convulsive spasm. A scream, thin and raw, tore from her throat. Her eyes flew open, wide with a mixture of terror and agonizing pain. They were blue. He noted with a strange sense of detachment, a deep, wild blue, now clouded with confusion and fear. She stared at him, this strange, bearded man looming over her in the lamplight, and tried to scramble away, to push him off. "No," she gasped, her voice hoarse. "Don't." "I have to," Noah said, his own voice sounding strained and foreign. He grabbed her wrists, his grip firm but as gentle as he could make it. She was surprisingly strong, fueled by panic. "Lie still, please. You have to lie still." "It hurts," she cried, the words a desperate, broken plea. She was fighting him, her body twisting, her breath coming in ragged sobs. "I know," he said, and the 2 words were the hardest he had ever spoken. He felt like a monster, a butcher. He was holding this terrified woman down while he prepared to hurt her more than she could possibly imagine. "I am sorry. God, I am so sorry. But the bullet has to come out." He pinned her shoulders to the cot with one forearm, a heavy, unyielding weight. With his free hand, he took the whiskey bottle and, ignoring her cries, poured the fiery liquid directly into the wound. The scream that erupted from her was no longer human. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound that Noah knew would haunt him for the rest of his days. Her back bowed, her fingers clawed at the rough blanket. Her teeth gritted so hard he thought her jaw would break. Then, mercifully, her eyes rolled back in her head, and she went limp, fainting from the sheer intensity of the pain. He released her, his own body trembling, sweat beading on his forehead and stinging his eyes. For a moment, he leaned against the wall, his breath catching in his throat, the woman's scream still ringing in the small cabin. This was his fault. He had done that to her, but he couldn't stop now. The worst was yet to come. He retrieved the knife from the hot water, the handle warm in his trembling hand. He took a deep drink from the whiskey bottle, the raw spirit burning a path down his throat, but it did nothing to steady his nerves. He returned to the cot. Her face was deathly white in the lantern light, a sheen of sweat on her brow. He took a deep breath. "Forgive me," he whispered. Then he made the first cut. Her body jerked, a reflexive response, but she remained unconscious. He followed the path the bullet had made. His jaw clamped shut. His focus narrowed to the horrific task. The work was slow, clumsy, and brutal. He probed with the tip of his knife, his other hand pressing down on the flesh around the wound. Time seemed to stop. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire, his own harsh breathing, and the sickeningly soft sounds of his work. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he felt it, the faint scrape of steel on lead. It was deep, lodged against a rib. He put down the knife and picked up the pliers. The tool, designed for pulling nails from wood, felt monstrously large and crude. He worked it into the opening he had made. He could feel her muscles quivering and contracting around the foreign object. He gripped the pliers tight, found the bullet, and pulled. It wouldn't budge. He repositioned, sweat dripping from his chin onto the woman's still body, and pulled again, this time with a sharp, twisting motion. There was a soft tearing sound, and then it was free. He pulled the pliers out, and in their jaws was a small, misshapen piece of lead, dark with blood. He dropped it onto the table with a clatter. The relief was immediately replaced by alarm. Dark, venous blood was now flowing freely from the wound he had enlarged. He grabbed the whiskey bottle again, pouring it over the gaping injury to cauterize and clean it. He packed the wound with a wad of clean cloth, applying firm, steady pressure. He held it for long minutes, his entire body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline, praying for the bleeding to stop. Slowly, it did. The flow subsided into a sluggish ooze. Working as quickly as he could, he applied a thick pad of cloth and then began to bind her abdomen with the strips of rag, wrapping them tightly to hold the dressing in place. When he was finished, he staggered back and collapsed into a chair. The room was silent again. Save for the fire, the air was thick with the smell of whiskey, sweat, and blood. On the table, the small, ugly piece of lead sat in a drying puddle. On the cot, the woman lay impossibly still, her life hanging by the thinnest of threads. He had done it. He had done the unthinkable. He didn't know if he had saved her, or just prolonged her suffering. He only knew that he had tried. He dropped his head into his hands, the tremors in his body finally consuming him. The tremors subsided slowly, leaving Noah Carter feeling hollowed out, an empty vessel in the echoing silence of his own home. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a bed of glowing, orange coals, and the lanterns cast long, dancing shadows that made the small room seem vast and unfamiliar. He sat slumped in the chair, his hands resting on his knees, staring at the still form on his cot. He had crossed a line tonight, a boundary he never knew existed, and he wasn't sure who he was on this side of it. The night stretched on, an immense, silent river of time. Sleep was an impossibility. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard her scream, felt the sickening scrape of his knife. So he kept watch. It was a vigil born of guilt and a terrifying sense of responsibility. Her life was in his hands now, a fragile flame he had nearly extinguished himself in the desperate act of trying to save it. He was her jailer, her tormentor, and her only hope. The contradictions churned inside him, a bitter, indigestible meal. He rose from the chair, his joints stiff, and moved to the hearth. He added logs to the fire, coaxing the flames back to life. The cabin needed to stay warm. He knew from bitter experience how a chill could steal the life from a weakened body. As the fire grew, casting a warmer, gentler light across the room, he turned his attention back to his patient. Her breathing was the only sound besides the fire, a shallow, yet steady rhythm. It was the metronome counting out the seconds of her survival. He knew he had to check the wound, to change the crude dressing he had applied. He dreaded it, dreaded causing her more pain, dreaded seeing the results of his brutal handiwork. But not checking it was not an option. He boiled more water, found another clean rag, and approached the cot. He worked with an almost reverent slowness. His large hands, which had been trembling so violently just hours before, now moving with a newfound steadiness. He gently untied the blood-stiffened strips of cloth. Peeling back the pad was a slow, careful process. The wound was raw and angry, an ugly gash in her pale skin, stitched together by nothing but her own will to heal. It was not bleeding, though. A small mercy. He cleaned the area as best he could with a cloth dipped in warm water and whiskey, his touch as light as he could manage. She moaned in her sleep, her brow furrowing. But she did not wake. He applied a fresh dressing and wrapped it securely. This became his rhythm for the rest of the night. He would sit, watch, and listen. Then he would tend the fire. Then he would take a damp cloth and moisten her cracked lips, trying to coax a few drops of water past them. Once. She swallowed reflexively, and the small victory felt as significant as a change in the seasons. He was a stranger in his own home. His life pared down to these simple, vital tasks: fire, water, and watching a stranger breathe. In the long, quiet hours before dawn, the walls of the cabin seemed to thin, and the past bled into the present. He looked at the woman's face, peaceful now in the firelight, and saw Sarah. He remembered sitting a similar vigil by his wife's bedside as a fever consumed her, her body burning from an invisible fire he was helpless to fight. He had held her hand, offered her water, and watched her slip away from him, his love and strength utterly useless against the sickness. The memory was so vivid that for a moment, the scent of herbs and sickness filled the room, overpowering the smell of wood smoke. He shook his head, pushing the ghost away. This was different. He hadn't been helpless this time. He had acted. He had committed a violent, desperate act in defiance of fate. He didn't know if it was bravery or foolishness, but it was not helplessness. The thought offered no comfort, only a stark, unsettling clarity. He had taken this woman's fate from the desert's hands and placed it squarely in his own. Dawn came not with a bang, but with a slow, gray leakage of light through the cabin's single window. The world outside turned from black to charcoal to a soft, pearly gray. The first birds began to sing. The new day felt fragile, tentative, just like the life on his cot. He must have drifted off in the chair, his head lolled back against the rough wood, for he was startled awake by a sound. It wasn't a moan of pain. It was a sharp, terrified intake of breath. His eyes snapped open. Clara was awake. She was propped up on one elbow, her eyes wide and wild with panic. The fire had burned low again, and the cabin was filled with the dim, uncertain light of morning. Her gaze darted around the unfamiliar room, the stone hearth, the rifle mounted on the wall, the stacked firewood before landing on him, on the large, bearded stranger sitting in a chair not 10 feet from her, watching her. Consciousness had returned to her not as a gentle dawn, but as a violent collision of fragmented sensations, a deep, throbbing ache in her side, the coarse texture of a wool blanket against her skin, the smell of smoke and memory, the desert, the attack, the searing, blinding pain. A face looming over her. This face, fear, cold and absolute, seized her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to get away. She tried to push herself up further, to swing her legs off the cot. But the movement sent a bolt of white-hot agony through her abdomen. She cried out, a sharp, choked sound, and fell back against the mattress, tears of pain and frustration springing to her eyes. She was trapped, helpless, a prisoner of the man who had hurt her. Noah saw the terror in her eyes, saw the way she shrank from him, and his heart, a thing he'd thought long dead, ached with a strange mix of pity and guilt. He knew what she must be thinking. He held up his hands, palms open, a universal gesture of peace. He did not stand up. He made no sudden moves. Easy now, he said. His voice was low and raspy from disuse. You're safe. The words were meaningless to her. Safe. The last time she'd felt safe, her father was alive beside her. The world had taught her in the most brutal way possible that there was no such thing as safety. Her eyes narrowed, the fear momentarily replaced by a flash of defiance. She stared at him, her chin trembling, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She was a cornered animal, ready to fight to the death, however weak she was. Noah held her gaze. He didn't try to placate her with more words. He simply let her look at him, let her see him in the clear morning light. He knew what he looked like, a rough, solitary man. His hair untrimmed, his face etched with hardship, his clothes plain and worn. He was not a comforting sight. He expected her fear to escalate, for her to start screaming. But she didn't. As she stared, her frantic breathing began to slow. The wild panic in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a confused, wary curiosity. She was looking at his face, but it was his eyes that held her. She had expected to see the cold glint of cruelty she remembered from her attackers, or the flat, empty gaze of a man who cared for nothing. She saw neither. His eyes, a pale, weathered gray like a winter sky, were not empty. They were full. They were full of a vast and terrible quiet, a stillness that spoke not of peace, but of a long and brutal war that had ended long ago, leaving behind a landscape of scars. She saw in them a profound and settled sorrow, a pain that had been lived with for so long it had become a part of the man himself. It was a look she recognized. She had seen a version of it in her own mother's eyes after her younger brother had been taken by river fever. She had felt it bloom in her own heart as she lay beside her father's body on the trail. It was the deep, permanent mark of loss. It was a pain that mirrored the fresh, screaming wound inside her own soul. This man was not her attacker. He was not a predator. He was broken, in the same way she was. The realization did not make her feel safe. Not truly, but it extinguished the terror. The immediate life-or-death panic drained away, leaving her utterly, profoundly exhausted. She stopped trying to fight, stopped trying to flee. Her body went limp, and she sank back fully onto the cot, her gaze never leaving his. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence returned. But it was different now. It was no longer the silence of solitude or the tense silence of a vigil. It was a shared silence, a fragile space being woven between two strangers in a lonely cabin, built on a foundation of unspoken, shared grief. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. Outside, the sun was rising, casting a single, golden beam of light through the window that cut across the dusty floor between them. It wasn't a promise, but it was a beginning. Days bled into one another, measured not by the sun, but by small, quiet milestones. The day the fever finally broke, leaving her drenched in a clean sweat and her skin cool to the touch for the first time. The day she could sit up on her own, the room tilting for only a moment before settling. The day she drank a full cup of thin broth, the warm liquid a blessing in her stomach. Through it all, Noah Carter was a constant, silent presence. He was a man of routine, and she was now a part of it. He would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to disturb her. She would lie with her eyes closed, listening to the familiar sounds, the scrape of the kindling box, the soft whoosh of the fire catching, the grind of the coffee mill. He would bring her water, and later, the broth. He would check her bandage with a clinical detachment that was somehow reassuring, his rough hands surprisingly gentle. He never spoke more than was necessary. More water. Are you cold? Try to eat. The questions were simple, direct, expecting nothing more than a nod or a shake of the head in reply. She learned him in the silence. She learned the way he stood by the window in the morning, coffee cup in hand, staring out at the vast emptiness as if searching for something he knew he would never find. She learned the weary set of his shoulders when he came in from the day's work, covered in dust and smelling of the sun and his horse. She learned that he never sat in the second chair at the small table, the one that faced the fire. It remained empty, a silent testament to a missing person, a space that was more occupied in its vacancy than if someone had been sitting there. He never asked her who she was or where she came from. He never asked about the wound, about the men who had left her for dead. His silence on the matter was a wall, but it felt less like a way of keeping her out, and more like a mark of respect for a pain he did not wish to disturb. He treated her not as a curiosity, but as a wounded creature he had taken under his roof, affording her the same quiet dignity he gave his animals. This unspoken respect did more to soothe her fear than 1,000 kind words could have. It allowed her to heal not just in body, but in spirit, in the quiet sanctuary of his cabin. About a week after she first woke, she felt a flicker of her old self return. The fog of pain and fever had receded, leaving behind a deep, throbbing ache and a profound weakness, but her mind was clear. She watched him that evening as he cleaned his rifle by the fire, his movements economical and precise. The lamplight caught the hard lines of his face, a face that had become as familiar to her as the wooden beams of the ceiling, and she knew it was time to break the silence. "My name is Clara," she said. Her voice was weak, raspy from disuse, but in the stillness of the cabin, it sounded as loud as a gunshot. Noah's hand stilled. He did not look up immediately, but continued to run an oiled cloth along the barrel of the Winchester. After a long moment, he set the cloth down and finally met her gaze. "Clara," he repeated. The name sounded strange in his deep voice, a foreign word in a language he rarely spoke. He gave a single, slow nod. Noah Carter. He offered nothing more. He did not ask her surname or her business, but he had given his name in return. It was an exchange, a bridge built across the silence. It was enough. The next day, she told him more. He had brought her a bowl of a thin porridge made from cornmeal, and she was eating it slowly, trying to ignore the protest from the muscles in her side. He sat at the table, mending a piece of leather tack, his head bent over his work. "Clara Weston," she said into the quiet. He paused his stitching, listening. "I was on my way to El Paso, with my father." The words came out in a rush, as if a dam had broken. Now that she had started, she felt a desperate need to make it all real, to give voice to the horror so it wouldn't live only inside her head. "We sold our farm back in Missouri. Papa said there was nothing left for us there after Mama passed. He heard there was good land to be had near El Paso. A new start." Her voice faltered. She took a shaky breath and pushed on. "We were on the old San Antonio road, maybe 3 days out. They came out of the rocks, 4 of them." Noah set down his leatherwork. He still did not look at her, but his entire body was still, his attention completely focused on her words. "It was over so fast," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the rough blanket that covered her. She could see it all again, the dust, the shouting, the terrible metallic sound of a pistol being cocked. They shot my father first. He didn't even have a chance to reach for his rifle. He just fell." A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She didn't bother to wipe it away. "They pulled me from the wagon. They wanted the money box. I didn't know where it was. Papa had hidden it. One of them. He had a cruel face. He smiled while he held the gun to my head." She shuddered, the memory of physical violation. "I fought back. It was foolish. That's when he shot me." She finally looked up at Noah. His face was a mask of stone, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. But she had to finish. She had to make him understand. "They took the horses, the wagon, everything. They rolled my father's body into a ditch. They thought I was dead, too. I heard one of them say the desert would take care of me. Then they rode away. They were laughing." The last word was a choked sob. She finished her story, and the cabin was filled with a silence that was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. She had laid the raw, bleeding wound of her past bare, and the vulnerability she felt was terrifying. She waited for him to speak, to offer some word of pity or judgment, but he said nothing. Noah sat motionless, his hands resting on the half-mended leather. Her story had not just entered his ears. It had detonated a series of mines buried deep within him. Each word she spoke had been a footstep in the haunted landscape of his own memory. Wagon. He saw not her wagon, but his own small buckboard, splintered and overturned at the entrance to his property. Bandits. He saw not the faces of her attackers, but the hazy, rage-filled images of the men he had tracked for 2 weeks, only to lose their trail in the mountains of Mexico. Shot. He saw his wife, Sarah, lying not by a roadside, but on the floor of this very cabin, a dark stain spreading across the simple dress she had made with her own hands. She hadn't been shot. It had been worse. A struggle, a blow to the head. The doctor in Harmony Creek had called it a brain fever before she'd passed 2 days later. They left her for dead. The most terrible parallel of all. He had been in town, selling a few head of cattle, delayed by a lame horse. He should have been home a day sooner. When he had finally ridden in, he had found his small son, 4-year-old Daniel, hiding in the barn, shivering and silent with a horror no child should ever know. And in the cabin, he had found Sarah. The bandits had thought her dead. 2. They had taken their food, their 2 best horses, and the $30 he had just earned. They had taken everything. Clara's fresh grief was a mirror reflecting his own 5-year-old wound. A wound that had never healed, had never even properly scabbed over. He had buried it under hard work and silence and the vast, empty sky. But it was still there, still bleeding inwardly. Her story tore the burial shroud away, and the pain was as sharp and fresh as the day it had happened. He finally raised his head and looked at Clara. His face was still a mask, but his eyes, those pale winter sky eyes, were no longer guarded. For the first time, she saw past the sorrow to the raw, unquenchable agony that lay beneath. It was a look of such profound, shared devastation that it took her breath away. In his gaze, she saw her own loss, her own rage, her own shattering grief, reflected back at her with an intensity that was terrifying and, in a strange way, comforting. He didn't have to say a word. He didn't have to tell her his own story. She knew. She knew that he understood in a way no one else could. Their tragedies were not the same, but they were forged in the same fire of senseless, brutal violence. They were survivors of the same undeclared war. 2 people left behind by the wreckage. 2 wounds, one new and raw, the other old and festering, had just touched in the quiet of the small cabin. The contact was excruciating, but for the first time, for both of them, it felt like the beginning of a cleansing. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of the truth that now lay exposed between them. Then he stood, picked up a log, and placed it carefully on the fire. The flames leaped up, casting their dancing light on 2 solitary figures who were, in that moment, completely and utterly alone, together. The morning after her confession, the silence in the cabin had changed. It was no longer a void separating 2 strangers, but a shared space, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. When Noah brought Clara her morning broth, their eyes met over the rim of the steaming bowl. There was no need for words of comfort or pity. In that brief, steady gaze, there was a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of their shared citizenship in the lonely country of grief, for the first time since she had woken in this strange place. Clara did not feel like a patient or a prisoner. She felt seen. A fragile peace settled over the small room, as delicate as a spider's web in the morning dew. After Noah left for his morning chores, Clara found the strength to push herself to her feet, leaning on the back of the chair. She took a few shaky, painful steps to the small window. It was the first time she had stood on her own, The first time she had looked out at the world that had tried to kill her. The landscape was still vast and intimidating, but from the safety of the cabin, it looked different. It looked like his land, a place that one man had carved out of the wilderness and refused to surrender. The thought gave her a sliver of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Noah, meanwhile, rode out toward the southern fence line, the place where his property bordered the open range. The air was cool and clean, the sky a vast, unbroken bowl of blue. The quiet confession of the previous evening had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. It had stirred the sediment of his own past, clouding the careful, quiet waters of his solitude. He felt a grim, familiar anger simmering just beneath the surface, an old enemy he had long tried to starve into submission. He pushed the feeling down, focusing on the simple, physical task at hand. The fence was his boundary, a clear line drawn against the chaos of the wild. It needed tending. He saw the tracks from 50 yards away. They were a discordant slash in the otherwise undisturbed dust, a sign of intrusion that set every nerve in his body on high alert. He dismounted from Apollo, his hand instinctively going to the colt at his hip, and knelt for a closer look. There were 3 horses, maybe 4. They were shod, the iron shoes leaving clean, sharp crescents in the soil. Not local Apache, then, and the tracks were fresh. The edges were still sharp, not yet softened by the morning wind. They had been here during the night, under the cover of darkness. His eyes followed the trail. They hadn't tried to cross the fence. They had ridden its length, following it in a wide, circling path around his homestead. It was the movement of a predator sizing up its prey, testing for weakness, searching for the easiest point of entry. They had come close, too close, to the small corral where Apollo spent the night. They had looked, and they had listened. And then they had retreated, melting back into the landscape from which they came. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, settled in his stomach. These were not common drifters. Drifters were lazy. They would have cut the fence and been on their way. These men were patient. They were hunters. And he had a sick feeling he knew what they were hunting for. They had left a witness behind, a loose end. They had come back to tie it off. He stood and walked slowly along the fence line, his gaze sweeping over the posts, the wire, the ground. Everything seemed in order. Perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps it was just curious riders passing through. But the instinct that had made him stop for Clara's cry in the first place was screaming at him now, a silent alarm in his blood. And then he saw it. On the thickest post, the one made from a solid piece of juniper that marked the corner of his property, something was carved into the weathered gray wood. It was fresh. He could see the pale, raw grain of the newly exposed wood. It was a crude, angry-looking symbol, gouged into the post with the tip of a knife. The shape was unmistakable, the head of a hawk or an eagle, its beak open in a silent scream. But there was more. The edges of the carving had been deliberately blackened with fire, the wood charred and blistered around the image, a scorched hawk's head. Noah stared at the mark, the morning sun feeling suddenly cold on his skin. He had seen signs like this before, in his angrier, younger days, the days after he had lost his family, when he had ridden with posses and marshals, hunting for any trace of the men who had destroyed his world. It was a brand, the signature of a particular kind of scum. Not just bandits who stole and ran, but predators who marked their territory, who reveled in their reputation, who left their mark as a warning and a promise of violence. They weren't just after money. They reveled in the fear they created. The men who had attacked Clara were not a random accident. They were part of an organized pack, and their brand meant they considered this territory theirs. They had come back not just to silence a witness, but to reclaim what they saw as their property, to punish the trespasser who dared to offer her sanctuary. The fragile peace of the morning was not just broken, it was annihilated. The cold dread in his stomach hardened into a familiar, icy rage. They had brought their poison to his door. They had followed the trail of human misery, and it had led them here, to his last refuge. They had unknowingly circled the one place on earth where a man who had already lost everything had made his final stand. He turned and walked back to Apollo, his movement stiff, his face set like granite. The ride back to the cabin was a blur. He no longer saw the beauty of the morning, the sweep of the plains, the distant mountains. He saw only angles of attack, places for ambush, the vulnerabilities of his small, lonely fortress. The cabin, which had been his sanctuary, was now a target. Clara, who had been a symbol of his past failure, was now the catalyst for a future confrontation he had spent 5 years trying to avoid. The chaos he had run from had found him. It had tracked him down and carved its name on his front gate. When he reached the small rise overlooking the homestead, he reined Apollo in, his eyes fixed on the cabin. He saw a figure standing in the doorway, bathed in the morning light. It was Clara. She was standing on her own, her hand braced against the doorframe, her thin form silhouetted against the dark interior. She was looking out, not at him, but past him, at the vast, empty plains that stretched to the horizon. He urged Apollo forward, a sense of foreboding quickening his pace. As he dismounted by the water trough, she turned her head to look at him. Her face was pale, her eyes large and dark, but the fear he had seen in them before was gone. In its place was a chilling, resolute calm. It was the calm of a person who has already faced the worst and has no illusions left. He didn't have to tell her what he had found. He didn't have to show her the tracks or describe the scorched mark on the fence post. She already knew. She had felt it in the air, in the unnatural stillness of the morning, in the sudden silence of the birds. She had survived them once, and her very bones had memorized the feeling of their presence. As he walked toward her, wiping the dust from his face with the back of his hand, she spoke, her voice not much more than a whisper, yet it carried across the yard with absolute certainty. "They're coming back," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a prophecy. He stopped a few feet from her, his shadow falling across the porch steps. He looked into her eyes and saw his own grim resolution reflected there. She was not the same woman he had found half dead in the desert. The terror had been burned out of her, leaving behind something harder, something forged in pain and survival. And in that moment, Noah knew. He knew that the life of solitude he had built for himself was over. The past had come to collect its due, but this time, he was not absent. This time, he was not too late. This time, the violence would not be a one-sided affair. He would not run. He would not hide her. This cabin, this small patch of land, was the last piece of the world that belonged to him. He had been driven here, and he would be driven no further. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. This time, no one was running. This time, they would be ready. The moment Clara spoke those words, the fragile peace of the morning shattered, and the day was reborn with a grim and terrible purpose. The air itself seemed to grow thin and sharp, and the familiar landscape outside the cabin window transformed into a hostile territory, every rock and shadow a potential hiding place for the coming danger. Noah's face, already a mask of grim resolve, hardened further, the lines around his eyes deepening as if he were staring into the heart of a forge. He did not waste a single second on questions or doubts. He moved. His actions were not frantic or panicked. They were the deliberate, economical movements of a man who had mentally rehearsed this moment in the darkest hours of the night for 5 long years. It was a ritual of survival, and every step was freighted with the weight of the past. First, he went to the main door. Leaning against the interior wall was a thick, heavy beam of oak, its surface dark and smooth with age, covered in a fine layer of dust. He hadn't used it since the first year he'd built the cabin, back when the fear of what lurked in the night was still fresh. With a low grunt of effort, he lifted the beam and settled it into the 2 heavy, iron brackets he had bolted to the door frame on either side. The sound of the solid wood sliding into the iron cradles was a deep, resonant thud of finality. It was the sound of a gate being locked, a tomb being sealed. Next, the window. It was the cabin's greatest vulnerability. A single, large pane of glass he had hauled all the way from Harmony Creek, a luxury that now felt like a fatal extravagance. He had no shutters. He strode to the rough-hewn table, his boots heavy on the plank floor. Without hesitation, he swept his arm across its surface, sending the tin plates and coffee cups clattering to the floor. With a powerful heave, he upended the table, its legs pointing to the ceiling like a dead animal's. It was heavy, made of solid pine, and it would have to do. He dragged it across the room and leaned it against the window, the flat tabletop completely obscuring the glass. It wasn't perfect, but it would stop a man, or at least slow him down. He found his hammer and a handful of long nails, and with a series of loud, percussive blows that echoed in the tense silence, he began to nail the table's legs directly into the log walls, anchoring it in place. Each hammer strike was a declaration of intent, a drumbeat signaling his refusal to yield. Clara watched him from the cot, her hands clutching the rough wool blanket. The violence of his preparations, the loud, definitive sounds of their world being sealed off, should have terrified her. Instead, a strange, cold calm settled over her. The waiting, the not knowing, had been a kind of torture. This action, this grim work, was a relief. The battle had been declared. The lines were being drawn. When the window was secured, Noah turned his attention to his arsenal. It was not a large one, but it was well maintained. From the pegs above the fireplace, he took down his Winchester rifle, its wooden stock worn smooth from his hands. From a locked wooden chest, he retrieved the Colt revolver and a box of cartridges. He laid the weapons on the cot at the end opposite from where Clara sat, his movements methodical. He broke open the revolver, checking that each chamber was empty. He took a small piece of oiled cloth and began to clean each component with a focused intensity, as if the act of purification could somehow influence the outcome of the coming fight. The sharp, metallic smell of gun oil filled the cabin, mingling with the scent of wood smoke and old dust. Clara watched his hands as he worked. They were large and calloused, hands made for roping cattle and splitting logs. Yet they moved with a surprising dexterity, handling the intricate metal parts of the guns with an intimate familiarity. There was no pleasure in his work, only a grim, practiced competence. This was a man who understood the mechanics of violence. When the guns were cleaned to his satisfaction, he began to load them. He pushed the heavy .44, 40 cartridges into the loading gate of the Winchester, the slick brass shells clicking softly as they slid into the magazine tube, one by one. A prayer in brass and lead. He worked the lever action once, chambering around, and then carefully set the hammer to half-cock. He did the same with the revolver, loading each of the 6 chambers, the cylinder turning with a soft, satisfying ratchet. Finally, all was ready. The cabin was a fortress, dark and sealed, the only light coming from the flickering flames in the hearth. Noah stood in the center of the room, a looming silhouette. He looked from the barricaded door to the blocked window, then to the loaded weapons, and then he looked at Clara. "There's a root cellar," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The trap door is under the rug by the hearth." Clara stared at him, not understanding at first. "It's not deep," he continued, "but the walls are stone and the door is thick. You'll be safe down there. Once I put the rug and a chair over the door, they'll never find it." The cold calm that had sustained her shattered, replaced by a surge of ice water panic. A small, dark hole in the ground, a trapdoor, to be sealed in the earth while violence raged above her. The image was too close to a grave. It was a cage. It was the helplessness of the desert all over again. But this time it would be a cramped, suffocating darkness, where she could only listen and wait, and imagine the horrors unfolding just a few feet above her head. No, she said, the word coming out stronger than she expected. Noah's expression didn't change. He seemed to have expected her refusal. It's not a request. Clara, it's the safest place. It's the only place. No, she repeated, shaking her head, her knuckles white as she gripped the blanket. I won't hide in a hole like a frightened rabbit. I won't be buried before I'm dead. A flicker of impatience crossed Noah's face. This was a detail he had not accounted for the defiance of the person he was trying to protect. You don't understand. These men, I understand them better than you do, she shot back, her voice trembling with a sudden, fierce energy. I have looked into their eyes. I know what they are. Hiding won't save me. If they get to you, they will find me. They will take their time. I would rather die on my feet than be dragged from a hole. Her words hung in the air, a raw and terrible truth. He had seen it as a tactical problem, a matter of securing a position and protecting a vulnerable asset. She was reminding him that it was about souls, about the final moments of a life, about the nature of a death. Still, the protector in him, the part of him that was driven by the ghosts of his past, would not yield. He took a step toward her. You are in no condition to fight. You can barely stand. You will go down there because it is the only logical thing to do. And what will you do? She challenged, her chin lifting. You will die up here, alone, trying to fight 4 men. What good is my safety then? That is not your concern, he said, his voice flat and hard. He had reached the edge of the cot. He looked down at her, his shadow covering her completely. For a moment, he was the intimidating stranger again, the man who had held her down and cut into her flesh. But she did not flinch. She held his gaze, her own eyes blazing with a fire he had not seen before. I will not be helpless again, she whispered, and the words were an oath. His jaw tightened. He could physically pick her up and force her into the cellar. It would be easy. But as he looked down at her, at the absolute, unyielding defiance in her eyes, he saw that he would be breaking something far more important than her will. He would be taking away the one thing she had left her choice. And he saw the ghost of Sarah, her face pale in the lamplight. And he remembered his own profound, soul-crushing helplessness. To inflict that on another, even in the name of protecting them, suddenly felt like the greatest cruelty of all. He let out a long, ragged breath, the anger and the certainty draining out of him, leaving behind only a deep, weary sorrow. He sank down onto the edge of the cot, not too close to her, and dropped his head into his hands. This isn't a cage, he said, his voice muffled. It's a promise. Clara frowned, confused. A promise. He lifted his head, and in the dim, firelit cabin, she saw it clearly for the first time, the raw, unguarded pain, the deep, aching wound in his soul that would never, ever heal. His eyes were not looking at her, but through her, into a past that was more real to him than the present moment. I had a wife, he said, the words rough, as if being pulled from the earth. And a son. They were here, in this room. Bandits came. I was away. I was too late. He finally looked at her, and his gaze was a physical weight. I promised myself, I promised them, I would never be too late again. Putting you in that cellar is my promise, that I will stand between you and them, that they will not get to you, that what happened to my family will not happen again, not on my land, not while I draw breath. The truth of it settled over her, silencing her defiance, extinguishing her anger. It wasn't about her weakness. It wasn't about caging her. It was about him. It was his penance, his act of atonement to the ghosts that shared this cabin with him. She looked from his tortured face to the empty chair by the fire, and she finally understood the depth of the silence he lived in. He had already lost everything. He could not bear to lose again. The sky outside was darkening, the light fading much too quickly for the time of day. A low moan began to sound around the corners of the cabin as the wind picked up, stirring the dust outside into swirling devils. The clouds were gathering like a dark army on the horizon, thick and bruised-looking. A storm was coming, a physical one to match the one they were bracing for. Clara reached out a hand, not to touch him, but just to close the distance between them. "Then you won't be alone this time," she said softly. "You will keep your promise, and I will keep mine. I will not be helpless." He looked at her hand, then back to her face. He saw no fear there now, only a quiet, unbreakable resolve that matched his own. He gave a single, slow nod. The argument was over. They would face this together. The wind howled, rattling the makeshift barricade at the window. The first drops of rain, fat and heavy, began to spatter against the roof, sounding like footsteps in the growing dark. The night, and everything it held, was coming. The hours that followed were a slow, grinding torment of waiting. The storm, as if summoned by the darkness in their own hearts, descended upon the small homestead with a primal fury. The wind, no longer a mournful moan, became a physical presence, a shrieking entity that threw itself against the log walls and tore at the roof shingles. Rain came not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets, blurring the world outside into a churning gray chaos. And then came the thunder, great, bone-jarring peals that rolled across the plains like the wrath of God, each one followed by a flickering blue-white flash of lightning that momentarily lit the cabin's interior with a ghostly, terrifying clarity. Inside the sealed, lamp-lit room, the air was thick with tension. Noah and Clara did not speak. There was nothing left to say. The time for words was over, and the time for action was not yet upon them. They were suspended in a terrible limbo, every nerve stretched taut, listening. They listened past the roar of the wind and the drumming of the rain, listening for a sound that did not belong, the one sound that would signal the end of their waiting. Noah had taken up a position near the hearth, his Winchester rifle resting across his knees. Clara sat on the cot, her back pressed against the solid log wall, a small, old model Colt Patterson revolver resting in her lap. Noah had retrieved it from the bottom of his chest, a relic from his past he hadn't touched in years. He had shown her how it worked, his voice low and steady, his hands guiding hers until she understood the simple, deadly mechanism. The gun felt unnaturally heavy in her hands, a cold, alien weight that did not belong to her. It was a promise of violence, a thing she never thought she would touch, and now her life might depend on it. After an hour of the suffocating stillness, Noah stood. "I'm going to the barn," he said, his voice cutting through the noise of the storm. Clara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. "What? Why you can't go out there?" "It's the better position," he explained, his gaze sweeping over their small fortress. "They'll expect me in here. This is the house. This is what a man defends. They'll come for the door, maybe the window. They won't be expecting fire from two directions. It's our only real advantage." His logic was cold and sound, but it terrified her. "You'll be leaving me alone." "Only for a moment," he said, pulling on a heavy oilskin coat. "I'll be closer than you think. Keep the lamp burning low. Stay away from the door. Don't make a sound unless you have to. And if one of them gets in—" He looked at the revolver in her lap, and his eyes were full of a terrible, bleak necessity. "Don't hesitate." He didn't wait for her to agree. He moved to the door, lifted the heavy oak bar with a soft grunt, and slipped out into the raging storm. For a second, the wind and rain tore at the opening, a chaotic whirlwind of noise and water. And then the door was shut, the bar thudding back into place from the outside. And she was alone. The cabin, which had felt like a sanctuary, suddenly felt like a trap, the silence within its walls a screaming counterpoint to the fury outside. The wait stretched into an eternity. Clara tried to control her breathing, tried to quiet the frantic hammering of her heart. Every crackle of the fire, every groan of the wood in the wind, was the sound of an approaching footstep, the sound of a lock being forced. She held the revolver with both hands, the checkered grip slick with the sweat from her palms. The barrel pointed toward the door. It was a lull in the wind that betrayed them. For a brief, blessed second, the shrieking gale subsided, and in that pocket of relative quiet, she heard it, a sound that was not the storm, a rhythmic, muffled splashing, hoofbeats, not the frantic gallop of a horse in distress, but the steady, deliberate pace of riders who were unafraid of the night. They were here. In the barn, Noah heard it too. He stood in the cavernous darkness of the hayloft, peering through a small gap between the boards that gave him a clear view of the front of the cabin. He saw them emerge from the curtain of rain, 3 dark, hunched figures on horseback, moving like specters through the storm. They stopped 100 yards out, sitting motionless on their horses, studying the cabin with its single, glowing point of lamplight. They were sizing it up, just as he knew they would. He lifted the Winchester to his shoulder, the cold stock pressing against his cheek. He could try a shot from here, but the range was long, and the wind and rain made it a fool's chance. He had to wait. He had to let them get closer. As he watched, one of the figures dismounted and began to move toward the cabin on foot, a low, crouching shape that was almost invisible in the gloom. The other 2 split apart, one riding slowly to the left, the other to the right, their horses disappearing into the darkness at the edges of the property. They were flanking him. They were professionals. Clara's world had shrunk to the 4 walls of the cabin, her ears strained, trying to pinpoint a location, a direction. The hoofbeats had faded, absorbed by the renewed howling of the wind. She heard nothing but the storm. Where were they? Was the man on foot at the door? Was he at the window? The tension was a physical thing, a tightening in her chest that made it hard to breathe. Then, a new sound, a soft, scraping noise. It came from the back of the cabin. Her blood went cold. The back wall, the one with no windows, only the solid logs and the stone chimney. She had thought it was secure. The sound came again. A splintering noise, the sound of a knife blade being worked into the chinking between the logs. He wasn't coming through the door. He was making his own. She scrambled off the cot, her bare feet silent on the floorboards, the pain in her side a dull, forgotten ache. She pressed herself into the darkest corner of the room, behind the empty chair that was her silent memorial to his lost family. She raised the heavy revolver, her arms trembling from the strain. She could hear her own blood roaring in her ears. The scraping stopped. A moment of absolute silence followed, a silence so profound it was more terrifying than any noise. Then, with a soft pop, a section of the dried mud and grass chinking fell inward, followed by another. A small, dark hole appeared in the back wall, a hole that quickly widened as the man outside worked with a grim, quiet efficiency. Soon, the opening was large enough. A dark shape blocked the hole, and a man slid through, landing in a silent crouch on the floor. He was a silhouette against the faint light from the fire, a creature made of shadows. He rose to his full height, his head turning as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. He saw the empty cot, the barricaded window. He took a step toward the center of the room, his movements fluid and predatory. He had not seen her. Clara knew, with a certainty that defied reason, that this was her only chance. If she waited, if he saw her, she was dead. All of Noah's work, all of his pain, would be for nothing. The promise he had made to his ghosts would be broken. Her own promise, the one she had made to herself that she would not be helpless, welled up inside her. The shadow took another step. He was turning toward her corner. He was almost upon her. She squeezed her eyes shut and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a physical blow of sound that shook the small cabin. A brilliant flash of orange light momentarily burned the man's silhouette onto her vision. The revolver bucked in her hands, the recoil far stronger than she had expected, and a scream of pure, unadulterated terror was torn from her throat, a sound of both fear and a terrible, shocking triumph. The shadow stumbled back, a choked, guttural sound escaping his lips. He clutched at his chest, his dark form staggering for a moment before he collapsed, falling heavily to the floor with the sound of a felled tree. The gunshot and the scream were the signal. In the barn, Noah's blood ran cold and hot at the same time. He didn't wait to think. He kicked open the hayloft door and launched himself out, not bothering with the ladder. He hit the muddy ground in a crouch, the impact jarring his bones, the Winchester already at his shoulder. The two remaining riders were reacting, their plans shattered by the unexpected shot from within the house. One of them, the one who had circled to the right, was spurring his horse toward the front of the cabin, drawing his pistol. The front door was swinging open. The man Clara had shot must have unbarred it before he fell. Just as the rider galloped into the rectangle of light spilling from the open doorway, a bolt of lightning split the sky directly overhead. For a stunning, timeless second, the entire world was bleached in an impossibly bright, blue-white light. The rain became a torrent of falling diamonds, and the rider and his horse were a stark, frozen statue of violent intent. In that single illuminated heartbeat, Noah found his mark. He fired. The Winchester's roar was a deeper, heavier thunder that answered the storm. It was the sound of judgment. The rifle kicked hard against his shoulder. In the lingering flash of the lightning, he saw the rider thrown backward from the saddle as if hit by a giant, invisible fist. The horse shrieked and reared, its eyes wild, while its master hit the mud and did not move. The darkness crashed back in, absolute and disorienting. The thunder followed, a deafening crack that shook the very ground beneath his feet. One inside, one down, but as the spots faded from his vision, Noah saw the third man, the one who had circled left. He was not retreating. He was dismounting, using his horse for cover, and melting into the deep shadows at the back corner of the cabin, moving to flank him, moving to get a clear line of fire on the man who had just emerged from the barn. The fight was not over. It had just begun. The world outside the cabin door was a churning nightmare of mud and noise and violence. For Noah, the immediate seconds after he fired the Winchester were a blur of instinct and action. He worked the rifle's lever, the slick mechanical sound of the spent cartridge ejecting and a fresh one chambering a small point of order in the chaos. He dropped to one knee, the wet mud instantly soaking through his trousers, making himself a smaller target as he scanned the impenetrable darkness where the third man had vanished. The storm was his enemy and his ally. It masked his movements, but it also hid his foe. The wind tore at him, trying to rip the rifle from his hands, and the rain fell in a solid, blinding curtain. He could see nothing but the vague, dark shape of the barn, the starkly lit rectangle of his own open doorway, and the unmoving lump in the mud that had, a moment ago, been a man on a horse. A flash of orange bloomed from the darkness near the back corner of the cabin. The shot was a sharp, angry crack that was almost lost in the roar of the wind. The bullet whined past Noah's ear, so close he felt its heat. He fired back instantly, not at a target, but at the memory of the flash, the Winchester bucking against his shoulder. He knew it was a wasted shot, a gesture of defiance more than a tactical move. The man was smart. He was using the shadows, using the storm. He was a patient hunter, and Noah was now caught in the open. He had to move. To stay still was to die. He scrambled back, crab-walking through the sucking mud, trying to put the corner of the barn between himself and the unseen shooter. He had to get to a better position, a place where he could see without being seen. Another muzzle flash, this time from a different spot. The man was moving too, circling, using the chaos to his advantage. A bullet thudded into the log wall of the barn, sending splinters flying. Inside the cabin, Clara was paralyzed. After the deafening explosion of her own gun, her ears were ringing, and the acrid smell of burnt powder filled her nostrils. The heavy body of the man she had shot lay a few feet away, a dark, motionless heap on her floor. The sight was so horrific, so unreal, that her mind refused to fully process it. But the gunshots from outside, the sharp crack of a pistol and the deep-throated roar of Noah's rifle, were brutally real. They were the sounds of a battle she could not see, a fight for her life that was happening just beyond the walls of her small, fire-lit world. She crawled to the open doorway, her own pain a distant, throbbing drumbeat. She peered out into the maelstrom. She could see nothing but the driving rain and the swaying trees at the edge of the clearing. Then, another flash of lightning illuminated the scene in a series of stark, frozen images. She saw the body in the mud. She saw the riderless, panicked horse. And she saw Noah, a dark, crouched figure near the barn, his rifle raised. In that same instant, she saw the flicker of another shape, a man darting between the cabin and the woodpile. The darkness crashed back in, and she was blind again, her heart seized with a terror so profound it stole her breath. Noah knew he was being herded. The third man was a wolf, driving him away from the cover of the barn, pushing him back toward the open space in front of the cabin, back into the killing ground. He had to change the dynamic, to do something unexpected. He rose from his crouch and ran, not toward the barn, but straight for the cabin, for the light, for the open door. It was a desperate, foolish gamble, but it was the only one he had. If he could get back inside, he could turn the fortress back to his advantage. The attacker was surprised by the move. He had expected a retreat, not a charge. For a second, he was exposed. As Noah sprinted through the mud, he saw the man rise from behind the woodpile to take a clear shot. Time seemed to slow. Noah raised the Winchester, firing from the hip as he ran. A wild, unaimed shot meant only to make the man duck. The man did duck, but he was fast. He fired back. Noah didn't see the flash. He felt it. A sudden, violent, white-hot impact in his left shoulder. It was not a sharp pain. Not at first. It was a monstrous, concussive blow, as if he'd been struck by a blacksmith's hammer. The force of it spun him around, his legs tangling beneath him. The Winchester flew from his grasp, landing in the mud with a wet slap. He fell to his knees, his vision exploding into a constellation of black and white stars. Clara saw him fall. The world outside the doorway had been a terrifying abstraction of light and sound. But the sight of Noah stumbling, of his strong form collapsing into the mud, was a brutal, undeniable reality. It shattered her paralysis. It erased all fear, all pain, all thought, replacing it with a single, primal instinct: get to him. She scrambled through the doorway, out into the storm. The wind and rain hit her with a physical force, plastering her thin dress to her body, but she barely felt it. She half ran, half stumbled through the mud, her own wound screaming in protest. She reached his side just as he was trying to push himself up with his one good arm. "Noah!" she cried, her voice torn away by the wind. He looked up at her, his face pale and contorted in the gloom. Rainwater streamed down his face, mingling with the sweat of his exertion. He tried to speak, but only a low groan escaped him. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over him, not knowing what to do. The front of his shirt was dark and wet, and in the next flash of lightning, she saw that it wasn't just rainwater. It was blood, a dark, pulsing stain that was spreading with terrifying speed. She pressed her hands against the wound, a desperate, useless gesture. The blood was warm and slick against her palms. He flinched, his whole body shuddering with a wave of pain. Tears streamed down her face, indistinguishable from the rain. He looked at her, and through the agony in his eyes, she saw something else, a flicker of the same grim, terrible irony she had seen in him before. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a pained, terrible, and yet tender expression. His voice, when it came, was a raw, strained whisper, almost lost in the storm. "There, it hurts," he said. The words, her words, spoken back to her in this moment of his own agony, broke her heart. It was a confession, a shared creed of suffering that bound them together more tightly than any vow. He was acknowledging their mirrored pain, the terrible symmetry of their survival. From the shadows, the third man saw his victory. He had been patient. He had been smart. The rancher was down, the woman kneeling beside him, helpless. It was over. He broke from the cover of the woodpile and began to walk toward them, his pistol held steady in his hand. He was in no hurry. He was going to savor this. Clara heard the splash of his footsteps in the mud. She looked up and saw him coming, a dark, inexorable shape of death emerging from the storm. He was no more than 20 feet away, his face a pale oval in the darkness, his eyes fixed on Noah. He was going to finish him, and then he would come for her. The promise she had made to herself, the oath she had sworn in the quiet of the cabin, echoed in her mind. I will not be helpless again. Her gaze fell on the Colt revolver, the one Noah had given her. It had fallen from her lap when she rushed outside and now lay half submerged in the mud beside them. It was not the blind, terrified shot she had fired inside the cabin. That had been an act of pure survival, a reflex against the encroaching darkness. This was different. This was a conscious act. This was a choice, a shield she was raising to protect the man who had protected her, a debt she was repaying. With a surge of adrenaline that defied her own weakness, she lunged for the gun. Her fingers closed around the cold, muddy grip. It felt impossibly heavy. The attacker saw her move. His own pistol came up. A dark hole pointed directly at her heart. He was faster. He was stronger. He was going to win. But in his arrogance, he had forgotten the storm. At the exact moment his finger tightened on the trigger, a colossal bolt of lightning struck a tall pine tree at the edge of the clearing. The world did not just flash. It exploded into pure, white, blinding light. The sound was not thunder. It was a deafening, instantaneous crack, the sound of the sky itself being torn in two. The bandit flinched, his eyes squeezed shut against the blinding glare, his aim momentarily spoiled. It was all the time Clara needed. She brought the heavy revolver up with both hands, the barrel shaking, and pointed it at the center of the blinding afterimage of the man's form. She did not aim. She did not think. She pulled the trigger. The gun roared, its flame a dirty orange against the lingering white of the lightning. The bandit was thrown backward, his own gun discharging into the sky as he fell. He landed with a heavy splash in the mud and lay still. The thunder that followed was not a sound of the storm, but a final, deafening punctuation mark on the violence. It rolled over the small cabin, over the bodies in the mud, over the two figures huddled together in the rain. And then, nothing. The wind seemed to die in that instant. The rain softened to a whisper. The world, which had been a symphony of chaos just a second before, fell into a profound and absolute silence, broken only by the soft hiss of the dying fire from within the cabin and the ragged sound of two people gasping for breath. The battle was over. The silence that fell in the wake of the final gunshot was more profound and unnerving than the storm's fury had ever been. It was a vacuum, a hollow space where the screams and the thunder and the roaring wind had been. In the sudden shocking stillness, the world seemed to be holding its breath. Clara knelt in the mud, the heavy revolver still clutched in her hands, her entire body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline and terror. Rain, now gentle and soft, fell on her face, mingling with her tears. Beside her, Noah was a dead weight, his body slumped against her, his breathing a shallow, ragged sound. The immediate life or death crisis was over, but a new, quieter one was just beginning. He was losing blood, and the cold of the mud was seeping into him. She had to get him inside. "Noah," she whispered, her voice a raw croak. "Noah, you have to get up. We have to go inside." He stirred, a low groan vibrating through his chest. He tried to push himself up with his good arm, but his strength failed him. His head fell back, and his eyes, clouded with pain, found hers in the gloom. "The others," he managed to rasp. "They're gone," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength from his need. "It's over. They're all gone. Now, help me." It was a monumental effort, a clumsy, agonizing dance in the mud and rain. Clara, small and weakened by her own healing wound, somehow found a reserve of strength she never knew she possessed. She hooked her shoulder under his good arm, taking on as much of his weight as she could. Every step was a battle against the sucking mud, against the dead weight of his semi-conscious body, against the screaming protest of her own abused muscles. They stumbled and nearly fell a dozen times, two broken figures lurching toward the small rectangle of light that was the cabin door. Getting him through the doorway and onto the cot was the final, brutal trial. They collapsed together, Noah landing heavily on the straw mattress, Clara falling to her knees on the floor beside him, her breath coming in great, shuddering sobs of exhaustion and relief. For a long moment, she just knelt there, her forehead resting on the edge of the cot, the sounds of his pained breathing and the soft patter of the rain on the roof filling the silence. But there was no time for rest. She pushed herself to her feet, her body a single, unified ache. The man she had shot lay on the floor near the back wall, a dark, still shape that she forced herself not to look at. "First, Noah." She stoked the fire, her hands clumsy and shaking, until the flames leaped up, chasing the chill and the shadows from the room. She lit another lantern, flooding the cabin with a warm, steady light. She found the whiskey and the clean rags, her movements a mirror of his own from what felt like a lifetime ago. She cut away the sleeve of his blood-soaked shirt, her hands gentle, her heart pounding with a cold, steady fear. The wound was high on his shoulder, a ragged, ugly tear in the muscle. It was bleeding sluggishly, but the real danger, she knew, was what lay inside. With a deep, steadying breath, she cleaned it as he had cleaned hers, pouring the raw whiskey over the torn flesh. He cried out, a sharp, guttural sound, his body arching off the cot, but he did not have the strength to fight her. He fell back, his teeth gritted, a sheen of sweat on his pale forehead. There was no bullet to dig for. It had gone clean through. It was a small mercy in a night of horrors. She packed the entry and exit wounds with clean cloth and bound his shoulder and chest tightly, her knots firm and sure. When she was done, she collapsed into the chair by the hearth, the one he always sat in. Her body trembled uncontrollably. She had done it. She had faced the monsters, and she had won. She had tended to the wounded, and he was still breathing. But the cost of it was a gaping hole in the fabric of the world. 3 men were dead outside her door. A 4th was on her floor. She was no longer just Clara Weston, the farmer's daughter. She was a survivor. She was a killer. The 2 identities warred within her, leaving her feeling hollowed out and ancient. She must have slept, for she awoke with a start to the first, pale gray light of dawn filtering through the gaps in the barricaded window. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was cold. Noah was still unconscious on the cot, his breathing slow but even. The storm had passed. The silence outside was absolute. She knew what she had to do next. It was the hardest thing she had ever had to do, a task that went against every fiber of her being. But she could not leave them there. She could not let the rising sun reveal the night's carnage. This small patch of land, Noah's sanctuary, had been violated. It had to be cleansed. She took his shovel, its wooden handle smooth and worn from his hands. She went outside. The world was transformed. The sky was a soft, clean palette of pearl and rose, washed clean by the storm. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and sage. Every surface glittered with a million tiny jewels of water. It was a world of impossible, heartbreaking beauty, a beauty that was cruelly mocked by the 3 dark shapes that lay scattered in the mud. She did not allow herself to think. She did not allow herself to feel. She became a machine, driven by a grim, numb necessity. She dragged them, one by one, to a spot behind the barn, away from the house, away from the well. The work was brutal, a desecration of the beautiful morning. She dug a single, wide grave in the soft, wet earth. It took her hours, her own wound a constant, nagging fire. When it was deep enough, she rolled them in. She did not look at their faces. She shoveled the dark, rich earth back into the hole, her movements rhythmic and relentless, until the ground was level once more. She said no prayers. She offered no words. The storm had been their eulogy. The man inside was the last. She dragged him out and buried him with the others. When she was finished, she scrubbed the cabin floor with a bucket of hot water and lye soap, erasing the last physical trace of his intrusion. The act was a ritual, a purification. She was not just cleaning a floor. She was trying to scrub the stain of the night from her own soul. When she finally emerged from the cabin into the full light of morning, Noah was awake. He was sitting on the edge of the cot, his face ashen, his left arm bound tightly to his chest. He looked at her mud-caked dress and the exhaustion etched onto her face. His gaze drifted to the clean patch of floor, and then out the open door toward the spot behind the barn. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. He understood the terrible burden she had shouldered for them both. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his feet. He walked to the porch, leaning heavily on the doorframe, and sank down onto the top step, his back against a post. He stared out at the waterlogged fields, at a world that looked the same, but was forever changed. Clara brought a basin of water and a cloth and gently washed the grime from his face and hands. She redressed his wound with fresh bandages. Then she brought the other chair, the one that always sat empty, and placed it on the porch beside him. For the first time, she sat in it. They sat in silence for a long time, the quiet no longer tense or heavy, but soft and restorative. The sun climbed higher, warming their faces, slowly drawing the moisture from the thirsty land. The world was waking up around them. A meadowlark began to sing from a fence post, its song a liquid, joyful melody that seemed to mock the memory of the night's violence. They didn't need to speak of the horrors they had shared. The story was written in the bandages they both wore, in the new, deeper lines on their faces, in the quiet, shared knowledge in their eyes. He knew that she had saved his life. She knew that he had given her a life to save. They had faced the absolute worst that the world could throw at them, and they had not broken. They had stood together. They had saved each other, not just with bullets and knives, but with a stubborn, unspoken refusal to let the other fall. It was a bond forged in fire and blood, stronger and deeper than any spoken vow. "My father," Clara said softly, her voice barely disturbing the stillness. "He used to say that the land remembers, that it holds on to everything that happens on it." She looked out at the vast, greening plains. "I wonder if this place will remember last night." Noah was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "The land remembers," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. "But it also heals. The rain comes and washes the blood away. The grass grows back over the graves. It's the people who have the hardest time forgetting." He turned his head and looked at her, his gray eyes clear and direct. "But maybe we don't have to forget. Maybe we just have to learn how to live with the ghosts." In his eyes, she saw not just his own ghosts, but an acceptance of hers as well. He was making room. In the quiet, solitary world he had built to protect himself from pain, he was making room for her. Without thinking, she reached out and took his good hand. His fingers were rough and calloused, but they curled around hers, his grip surprisingly gentle. It was not a gesture of passion, but of something far deeper. It was an anchor in a turbulent sea, a quiet acknowledgement that neither of them was alone anymore. They sat like that as the sun warmed the wooden planks of the porch, their hands clasped together, their gazes fixed on the horizon. In the far distance, a flock of birds took flight, a dark, fluid ribbon against the brilliant blue sky. They wheeled and turned as one, catching a current of wind, and then soared away, higher and higher, until they were just specks in the vast, clean emptiness. They left nothing behind but the whisper of the wind and the promise of a new, unfiltered light. A beginning beneath the endless western sky. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. You can also show your support by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.